Morning, everyone. Nicholas Jacobson here, taking things a very different way than what you typically see from my content, being about either the board game or more recently about the active shooter, active threat. Today, I'm actually going to share something special and something personal. I'm going to start sharing different stories about one of my family members, specifically my grandfather, who served as a pilot in World War II. And starting tomorrow morning, I'm going to make a video every morning of the different missions he did, because it would have been 80 years ago from the day. To get things started, though, today's more of a background one. Before his first actual mission, so my grandfather, Richard Jacobson, I'm making these videos to not just share my story, hope encourage other people to start sharing their family histories and stories, and those who don't have stories about what their family members did in combat zones, to dig in, to be inspired to go and look. Because we have a history of war, and wars were fought by our family members. So this is going to be the one about my grandfather, Richard Dick Jacobson. I don't know, these are some, before he passed, there's photos of him in front of the B-17 bomber. This is the B-17 Foxtrot. He co-piloted one of these flying fortresses, and then later on piloted the P-51 Mustang. I don't know if these are members of his old crew specifically, or if these were guys who he happened to know from back in that time. But what was most special about him and his first crew is that they got an opportunity to fly a very unique plane. They flew what was known as the $5 grand, or the 5,000th Boeing-built flying fortress that was made since Pearl Harbor. And it was a big deal in the news back then. Here's all the people who were involved in the building of that plane, painting their 5,000th logos and signing every member. And here's all the people who are part of the line that made it. Each one of these people had their hands in building each one of the flying fortresses. A lot of hands making a lot of work. This is the 5,000th one. Maybe hard to tell, but there's signatures all over. There's so much paint from the signatures that the plane itself actually flew 5 miles an hour slower than other planes of the same class who had not been painted. My grandfather, here's a photo of him in the original 5 grand cruise they were known. This was the pilot, Captain Unger, or at the time he was Lieutenant Unger. And here is my grandfather, Richard Jacobson. And this was their crew. And they had the title of Seattle built, Seattle named, and bearing thousands of Boeing Seattle production workers' names, and Fortress 5 grand as a Seattle pilot and co-pilot in her crew. Lieutenant E.C. Unger standing left, and Lieutenant R.L. Jacobson next to Unger. A better photo of him with his crew is actually this one. So it's the same one. You can see they have the 5 grand behind him. They got that opportunity to take her on her maiden voyage from the United States and across to Ireland, really. This is it in flight past, I think this is Mount Rainier. Amazing photograph. I don't know if my grandfather was co-piloting it during this flight, and this is the maiden voyage flight. It's very possible that it was, though, because these photos actually came from Boeing. Boeing had presented these 2 photos to my great-grandmother, Inez, who I have numbers of letters that she'd sent back and forth with them, requesting all the information she could possibly get about her son and this plane, and even the old radio script that had been broadcast involving this flight and this plane. But what they did, we know great details about my grandfather. Very fortunate, because one of the crew members actually recorded each and every one of their missions. He wrote this, I think he intended to maybe write a book or a movie script one day. Call it the 5 grand, and a bunch of different names, to describe the different missions they had faced, but this is the crew that flew out of Boeing. John McBride was the one who authored this. A lot of this is going to be formally classified information, but this is a list of all the different bombing missions, and it continues on to the next page. All the different bombing missions this crew did together. The first one starting tomorrow morning, August 7th. So tomorrow I'm going to be sharing that specific mission, and then I went on in the 8th, 14th, and so on until we cover each one of his bombing missions. Yeah, August 7th, tomorrow will be the 80th anniversary of what they had done there. So you see, this was the actual crew. These were their names. You have John McBride, who wrote this. He was the armor gunner, left wing. I think that's what the LOW stands for, or left waist. Richard Jacobson, co-pilot. That's my great-grandfather, or my grandfather. What I'm sharing today, though, is that they weren't always the crew of the 5 Grand. They were known for it, and if you look them up in a Google search, that they will come up in the official record as the crew of the 5 Grand. That's when even from the Army Air Corps History Museum, their website shares them as the 5 Grand crew. But it was really, July 4th, 1944, presented to 5 Grand by Colonel Kearney, Nebraska. After an impressive ceremony, they flew it to Nebraska, had a ceremony there for a presentation. On July 9th, it says on the 4th of July, 1944, on July 9th, 1944, they landed in Bangor, Maine to rest and refuel. That next day, on the 10th, they stopped in Gander, Newfoundland before the big hop across the water. July 19th, they landed in Nuts Corner, Ireland, where they lost our plane. So they flew the plane into here, and then the plane traded crews. They wanted to get that plane immediately into service for combat. And this is very typical. Planes and crews were either flown over or taxied over into Ireland before being brought to England. They from there would switch crews, because the crews would have to go through in-processing and in-briefing. And they would have to put the crews out to where they were needed, which was not always the same place where the planes themselves were needed, as strange as that sounds. So Nuts Corner is somewhere right in this area. They then took a ship and crossed the Irish Sea. Now, the actual pilot, Unger, I think, flew with the plane itself on into England ahead of the group and did a couple of missions as a familiarization. They'd take as like a ride-along, if you will, of pilots who would then go with other crews so they get a feel for what they're seeing and what they're experiencing in the air. And so the crew, though, along with my grandfather, they crossed the Irish Sea and they landed right in the Liverpool area and actually ended up in Stone, England. Yeah, stayed at Stone, England, awaiting base to go to. And that was on July 22nd and 28th. And on the 28th, through April 4th is when they did all their combat missions, and starting that day they had been assigned to Station 174, which was in Sudbury. Sudbury is right here. Sudbury is a very known, one of the many different air bases in which planes flew out of when conducting operations into both France and Germany. Yeah, tomorrow though, we're going to go over, I'm going to start sharing mission by mission. Very fortunate to have this. This will be the teaser though. But I'm going to share these missions. I'm going to share my input and perspective, having been in the military and in combat arms branch. And so my perspective will be added to this, so that sometimes things are lost in translation. We've seen all the movies. But this will be their missions, and they were not flying the 5 Grand during these missions. 5 Grand did continue on its missions. This will be most will really say about the 5 Grand from here on out. 5 Grand, these are old articles. Seattle Post, 5 Grand gets hit on its first mission. I think you can actually look up that full article online. 5 Grand puts bomb load on German lines. They're incredible little shorts. The famous short snorter B-17, the 5 grand, autographed with thousands of Boeing workers. Name returned recently to her 8th Air Force Base, Army Air Force Base after bombing Nazi installations in Holland. Support of advancing Allied ground troops, according to the Army Dispatch. What does it say? None of the signatures were scratched by enemy action. And that was being piloted by Lieutenant Bryce H. Jones of Passon, Utah. So you'd see it was a completely different crew when they started doing those bombing missions. Another article about it, 35 trips flown by the 5 grand. And ultimately, it made its way back home. Seattle's own 5 grand is home after 78 missions. Now, that crew didn't fly 78 missions. It had traded hands a few different times, but in total, this plane itself went on 78 missions. But my grandfather and the crew he was with, they got to be the maiden voyage, and they get to be known for it. See, I started tomorrow. I'm going to start sharing these missions. The first mission was in Saint-Quentin, France. So I'm going to show you, go over the story. I'm going to read it as it works. I'm going to give my input on it. I may even have a few other materials. I have lots of other photos and other items to accompany some of this stuff. But yeah, we're going to talk about that and look at it from the maps. There's a couple different maps I have that were historical maps of that time, and showing you where he was and where he dropped bombs. So again, a lot of this is really for my family members so that they can know this part of the history, because otherwise I would never know this. This would just be kept with me, you know, kept quiet. But I'm also hoping to encourage you all who are followers of one of my pages to start sharing your family military history.